bonny Scotland, home to Braveheart and William Wallace, and the scene of a Scottish victory over the dastardly English that was so brutal you would not believe it. And if you stick around long enough, I'll show you the sickening act of revenge carried out by the Scots on the English tax collector. And this one, genuinely, is not for the faint-hearted. Welcome back. This episode is the first in a series looking at medieval battles and brutal historical events from the places where they happened. My name's Rob and I'm in the military, and I try to look at these events through the eyes of a modern military planner. We are, of course, in the town of Stirling, seen for the famous Scottish victory over the English army which was sent north to silence the Scottish Rebellion of 1297.
So picture Scotland in the 13th century, a really chaotic and turbulent period for Scottish but also European history. Ultimately, with the death of Alexander III, there were lots of competing cases for who would be the successor as King of Scotland. There are a number of really legitimate claims and a number of clans who were trying to fight for the right to be King of Scotland. So you will have heard of the Bruces, the Morays, for example, the Baliol's, a number of families who believed they had a legitimate claim. But because they couldn't decide who was going to be the successor, the Scottish, in all their wisdom, decided to invite the King of England, Edward Longshanks, Edward I, who later became known as Hammer of the Scots, to adjudicate and arbitrate on their behalf to ultimately make a decision about who should be the successor. Edward clearly saw an opportunity here, and he backed the Baliol claim. He saw Baliol as essentially a puppet ruler who he could influence to generate lots of tax to fight his wars overseas, but ultimately perhaps to usurp and to then have dominance in Scotland himself. So that's the background to this story. Edward I now had a lot of power in Scotland and controlled the family who had been decided to be the successors.
The trouble with Scotland is that it's full of Scots.
However, it didn't take the Scots long to realise that they'd made a terrible mistake in asking Edward I for his assistance. And sure enough, a rebellion started and the Scottish were now at war with the English. So let's look at some of the strategic context in terms of the location of Stirling. So Stirling has been described in a number of different ways. The first one is as the brooch of Scotland. So it's holding together the Highlands in the north and the Lowlands in the south. It's also really strategically important because it's one of the very few crossing locations to get from north to south or south to north. And perhaps I'll overlay a medieval map, which I've used before, which shows that essentially the Highlands were cut off from the Lowlands by the River Forth. And of course there are many locations that you can cross, but the main one is here at Stirling. So when we look at the strategic context right here on the ground, we can see that to the west, it's very boggy, it's very marshy. There are opportunities to ford the river further to the west. However, that is not the ideal location to try and maneuver your army. You can also cross further to the east, but that's where the river starts to widen and heads towards the estuary and out towards the sea, and therefore you'd need pontoons, you need boats, etc. to get your army across. By far the quickest way to move your army was via this bridge behind me at Stirling. And that's exactly what the English intended to do, and it's exactly where the Scottish knew the English would be likely to cross as well.
Before we go any further, I have a message from our paid partner, BetterHelp.
As a military professional, we are trained to identify stressors and anxiety, to understand when we are feeling anxious and what that might mean. Sometimes we can even work out what is causing us that anxiety, but sometimes we can't, and that's fine.
As a leader, it's imperative to cultivate and maintain strong relationships to help us be effective teams. But I've personally struggled with thinking, am I too needy or are my needs valid? Am I good enough for my team? Why do I sometimes feel like I'm not good enough? Well, in your personal relationships, do you ever ask yourself, why do I feel anxious every time they don't text back? Or why do all our conversations end in arguments?
Relationships aren't easy, and trust me, you are not alone. But it's time to stop asking those tough relationship questions into that endless void.
My paid partner, BetterHelp, will connect you with a therapist who can help you find answers to some of these questions. Instead of being stuck in an endless loop of questioning yourself, you can talk through relationship concerns with someone who's trained to help you find real answers. Get matched with a therapist after completing a quick questionnaire, and you can easily switch therapists anytime at no cost if it's not the right fit. BetterHelp carefully makes sure therapists on the platform are well qualified, and their customer support team is there to help you if you have any questions. With over 7,000 reviews and a 4.5 rating on Trustpilot, BetterHelp is a platform you can trust.
Now, going to therapy is a sign of strength. It's certainly not a sign of weakness. And there are so many relationships that can be improved with therapy, not just the romantic ones. So click on the link in the description below or visit betterhelp.com/History Explorer for 10% off your first month of therapy. So let's talk about the respective armies then. So first off, we're going to talk about the English. They were led by Hugh de Cressingham, who was the Earl of Surrey. Now, many people over the years have criticised him for being a poor military commander because of his handling of this battle, but he was actually incredibly competent. He had already defeated the Scots at the Battle of Dunbar, and he probably expected the Scottish to be exactly the same at this location. He probably expected them to be poorly led and poorly trained. And he knew that they lacked cavalry as well, which is where he had a significant advantage. Now, it's worth noting that the numbers for armies for this time period are incredibly unreliable. Sources claim that the army for the English was perhaps between 5,000 to 10,000 strong in terms of infantry and dismounted soldiers, with perhaps as many as 3,000 heavy horse. Now, interestingly for the English, they also had a chap called Hugh de Cressingham within their army, and he was essentially the treasurer in Scotland. So he was responsible for collecting all the taxes, and he was incredibly disliked, is probably the best way of saying it, in Scotland. And he has not been treated well by history. So now let's talk about the Scottish armies. I've already told you that they had fewer numbers than the English, and they also lacked cavalry. Essentially, they had hardly any. I think they had less than 100 individuals who could mount a horse and be classified as cavalry. This goes back to the Battle of Dunbar, where the Scottish cavalry contingent was defeated, almost entirely wiped out, and the nobles, many of them, were taken as prisoner. So the Scottish relied very much on dismounted infantry, but one of their strengths was that they used essentially what we call today pike infantry. They were armed with very large spears. Think to sort of Hellenistic type warfare, perhaps like hoplites. They organised themselves into tight formations with long spears, which is great for defeating cavalry. Now, people call this the Scottish rebel army, but it's actually a joining of two armies. So what people don't necessarily understand about Scotland is that just as it is today, the Highlands of Scotland and the Lowlands of Scotland are very different. They are different people. And at the time, the Highland army was led by a chap called Andrew de Moray, and the Lowland army was led by William Wallace. And they actually joined forces, and perhaps the best expression of that joining of those two armies was here at Stirling. The English relied on the chivalric code that you would basically form up your armies, you would then wait for each other to be ready, and you'd engage in combat. And God would decide ultimately who was victorious, and therefore the victory would be just. Now, the Scots didn't necessarily abide by this chivalric code. What they did was wait for just enough English to be across the bridge before they launched their attack.
We're now looking at an overview of Stirling, and you can see the River Forth which winds its way through the town today. Abbey Craig is highlighted here in blue, and that is the Scottish position. They occupied this high feature, and they could see down into the valley and to the crossing point below. Stirling Castle and the surrounding hill is highlighted here in red. This is where the English army was encamped, and I should say the English army actually included lots of Scottish and Welsh fighters too. And here we can see Stirling Bridge, although this is not the original. I've added the location of the original bridge to the map. The bridge was wooden and barely wide enough for two horses to pass. To cross the river, the English began their move down towards the bridge.
Right, we're now making our way over Old Stirling Bridge, barely wide enough for two horses to get across. At least that's what was claimed at the time. Now the real kicker is that even though this is an old bridge and it is narrow, this is not the original bridge. I'm sad to say. This bridge, I mean, even though it's about 300 years older than America, it is not the original bridge. The original bridge for the Battle of Stirling Bridge was located just down here. And it would have crossed the river pretty much where that large collection of bushes is, pretty much center screen, and it ran diagonally towards the side of the bank there. And in the background, you can see the Abbey Craig, and that is where Wallace was located. From that position, he was watching down here onto the flat land. Remember, none of this housing and development would have been here. And he would have been able to see the English army cross the bridge and start to form up on the other side. And that side of the river was low-lying, it was flat, and the going was really difficult. It would be terrible for cavalry, and especially as they hadn't formed up, they just wouldn't be effective at all. So he seized his opportunity.
The English had managed to move about half of their troops across the bridge, but they were disorganised. Cavalry was mixed with infantry and archers, and they were still getting into position on the battlefield, forming up into their conventional lines ready for their conventional war. Importantly, the English troops who had crossed the bridge were now constrained by the terrain. They were almost completely surrounded by the river in this bend. It almost looks like a sack with the English troops trapped in the bottom, the river at their back, the only way out towards them or the bridge behind them. This is not a good position to be in. Without realising it, the English had generated their own trap, and the Scottish, led by Andrew de Moray and William Wallace, decided to act now, while the English were at their most vulnerable. De Moray and Wallace had two options. They probably intended to defend the high feature at Abbey Craig in order to counter the English heavy horse advantage. But this complacency by the English created a brilliant opportunity for the Scottish commanders. Content that there was no English flanking force further down the river, they came down from the Abbey Craig and they formed up into their schiltron formations, long spears in deep ranks. People often see these as defensive units, but when controlled, they can advance effectively into enemy formations.
Now, of course, you don't need to be a military genius to know that cavalry works best in open field, dry conditions where the going is good. And they would form tight formations, advance at speed and charge into infantry, ideally not square formations with lots of long spears. But in this case, the cavalry couldn't get up any speed at all. They were caught while they were forming up, and they were mixed in with infantry, mixed in with archers. So it was an absolute disaster. We'd call this today a disruption attack. While the enemy is forming up, they're in a forming up point, for example, you would strike them then before they have time to get ready. And that's exactly what happened here at Stirling Bridge.
Disorganised and surprised by the speed of the Scottish attack, the English were pushed back to the riverbank. The bridge was now cut off. Many of the English tried to chuck down their weapons, take off their armour and flee across the river. The Scottish cut them down.
But it wasn't all doom and gloom for the English. Although they were heavily defeated right here at the time and pushed back into the river, there was an English knight called Marmaduke Fweng, great name, who, realising that the situation was lost, he gathered together some of his heavy horse and they charged back across the bridge, and they actually managed to get to the other side, fighting their way through the Scots who were already blocking the bridge, and then the fighting which was taking place on the bridge. And they managed to barge their way through essentially on that very narrow wooden bridge, and they got back to the other side. Okay, so we're going to go back over the bridge and follow the route that Marmaduke Fweng would have taken when he charged back across the bridge to try and get to the home bank. The far bank, as this is called, was completely lost. The majority of the English forces had been destroyed, killed or captured, or had tried to swim back across the river. So the cause was lost. Let's go and check it out. So now heading back up the old bridge. Now, this is looking back towards the English side of the river. You can see Stirling Castle right there through the bridge gates, right on top of that hill. Now remember, this is not the original bridge. The bridge has been replaced, but this does go to illustrate just how narrow the bridge would have been, because it would have been even narrower than this one. And contemporary accounts, as I said, say that only 2 horses at a time could pass. So we're just coming up to the halfway point on the bridge now, looking back to the English side. So that's where the English would have come from. And you can see Stirling Castle up there on the hill. You can see the high ground just beyond those trees, which is where the Scottish came from. And you can see just how narrow this bridge is. Now remember, this is not the original bridge. The original was even more narrow. And we believe the original bridge was located just here. Now, I've already said how the treasurer, Hugh de Cressingham, was a really unpopular man and history has not been kind to him at all. And a point that perfectly illustrates this is that when he was killed, which happened right here, his body was skinned, allegedly, by Wallace, and artifacts and clothing were made out of his skin. And one example is that a strip of skin was taken from the base of his head all the way down to his ankles, to his Achilles. And it was used to create a sword belt, and those sword belts are called baldricks. I'll put a picture of exactly what a baldric looks like. There's also claims that his skin was used to create the hilt and the handguard for Wallace's sword as well. Whether these are true or not, we don't know, but it's certainly a grisly end to not a very popular man. I have to say, nobody likes the tax man. So I'm stood on the southern side of the river at the moment. So my back is towards England and the southern area of Scotland, what we call the lowlands. And where the camera is facing is to the north of Scotland, the northern side of the river. Now you can clearly see that the terrain changes drastically. We've got this flat, what traditionally would have been a flood area, very boggy, very marshy, sort of flat area. And then it suddenly breaks away into the Scottish Highlands. And believe me, the Highlands get even higher the further north you go. But you can see the change in terrain. And so just here in the centre of the screen now with the monument on top is the Wallace Memorial. And that is where the Scottish forces, so Andrew de Moray and William Wallace, were based and where their forces were encamped. They could look right down into this low ground where we've just come from, which is down in towards Stirling Bridge. And you can't actually see the bridge from here, but all of those buildings would not have existed at the time. None of the village actually went that side of the bridge. But this is all low-lying floodland, and you can see the curve in the river there. So beyond those houses is where the bridge is. The English came from, you can just see that promontory there on the hill, that is Stirling Castle. So the English were encamped in and around that area, and they were observed to be vacating that area and heading down to essentially form up here in this location. The English were going to form up right here on this flat land, and they were going to wait till the Scottish to come down and form up, opposing them, and then they'd have a battle. That is how chivalric European armies of that period used to conduct warfare. Wallace did not want to fight fair, or rather, some people say Andrew de Moray, who was the sort of military nous behind this action. They say that he did not want to allow the English to have this advantage, to use this flat terrain with their heavy horse to charge over the Scottish. This was a disruption attack to fight the English when they were at their most vulnerable, which is during an obstacle crossing. It is exactly the same today. Armies, formations, battle groups are at their most vulnerable when they are conducting an obstacle crossing.
I really hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have and you'd like me to cover more medieval history from Britain, then let me know in the comments below. If you want to know what happened next to the Scottish Rebellion, then be sure to check out my future series on the Scottish Wars. Up next, I visit Normandy again, where I cover a series on the US airborne forces during D-Day, taking you to locations that you've told me you want to see. Until next time.